Hello, and welcome to my JALT presentation, Gathering Students' Perspectives on Anecdotes and L2 Identity Formation. As you may or may not know, I've started a new research endeavor on L2 storytelling and on the anecdote form in particular. I'm really excited to share with you my initial results. Let's get started. Well, here's today's talk outline. First, I'm going to start with a background on storytelling and anecdotes. Next, I'm going to talk about how I've used anecdotes in my classes. Then I'm going to introduce my pilot research on anecdotes. Finally, I'll provide some Q&A time. If you Google storytelling, you're going to find some common results. Probably a majority of the hits will be content from business organizations such as the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, or this one from Harvard Business Review, whose content focuses on how CEO or business types can use storytelling to be more effective leaders. You might find articles such as this one from the Los Angeles Times, which explores how storytelling can encourage social change. Storytelling has also received attention from neuroscientists who are exploring the links between storytelling and memory. Now, the promotion of stories in classrooms is not something new in education. As a matter of fact, here's an example from Marie Shedlock, who is a former school teacher turned professional storyteller around the turn of the 20th century. She wrote, "I think we are on the threshold of the rediscovery of an old truth, that the dramatic presentation is the quickest and surest because it is the only one with which memory plays no tricks. If a thing has appeared before us in a vital form, nothing can really destroy it. It is because things are often given in a blurred, faint light that they gradually fade out of our memory." I think what Marie Shedlock is saying here is that storytelling is the best way to capture memories for long-term retention, especially in light of today's popular content delivery mechanism in the classroom, that is, the PowerPoint presentation. I think her words are especially relevant. Let's take a look now at the theory. What is the theoretical justification for incorporating anecdotes in our L2 classrooms? First of all, it provides comprehensible input. I'm sure we're all familiar with Krashen's input hypothesis. For instance, if students are sharing anecdotes with each other, they are more than likely sharing language that is at or slightly above their language level. It also provides an excellent opportunity for comprehensible output. So when students are delivering an anecdote, there are many opportunities for them to notice gaps in their current linguistic level. Also, as Shala Chapur wrote, it exposes students to authentic communication. So there are opportunities for students to clarify, to question, to interrupt in a natural context. And also, as Jones wrote, anecdotes frequently occur in everyday conversations, so it's also reinforcing this idea of an authentic task. Finally, in my view, especially if you have students share their own anecdotes, you can avoid Freire's banking model of education, which he criticized in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In this model, teachers are seen as the sole possessors of knowledge, and students are seen as vehicles into which teachers deposit such knowledge. Incorporating student-told anecdotes can level the playing field in which students' comments, opinions, and experiences are valued. It's important also to define what exactly is an anecdote. Labov noted that the central requirement for an anecdote is a most reportable event. So the speaker has to have a reason to hold the floor with an interlocutor. This most reportable event is something that's noteworthy or interesting, so it's important to note that what is reportable depends on the context and the culture. I remember after teaching one of these lessons, my student asked me a really good question. What's the difference between an oral presentation and an anecdote? So I explained to her first, let's think about what you know about oral presentations. You're going to use academic English, your best grammar and your vocabulary. The tone is usually quite formal and serious, and the body of the content contains a lot of evidence, research, and facts. If we think about an appropriate length, it could be anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. And if we consider the role of the listeners, they should be quiet until the end of the presentation. What about anecdotes? Well, anecdotes are spoken in nature and as a result can contain casual English, including phrasal verbs and slang. The tone of the language can be various, and also it's acceptable to be emotional as well. The content can include things such as feelings, reaction, dialogue, and the length usually is very short, a few minutes or less. And the role of the listeners is quite different. They can interrupt the speaker, ask questions. They're a lot more involved in the conversation. Now let's talk about the 3 lessons in which I incorporated a spoken anecdote task. The first class focused on anecdote content. I covered things such as narrative structure, for instance, how information is organized, beginning, middle, and end, and what is expected in those stages. Common vocabulary and phrases that you can use in anecdotes. I've also included information on specific grammatical choices that you can make in an anecdote, for instance, particular verb tenses. And in this class, I've scaffolded the tasks. So, for instance, in some of the early tasks on this handout, students just simply complete a sentence and tell a story in a sentence. So, throughout this lesson, students practice elements of storytelling and anecdotes piece by piece. So, at the end of the 3rd lesson, they're able to produce their own anecdote. Before introducing the 2nd lesson, I'd like to play a clip from Julian Treasure's TED Talk in which he describes the power of the human voice.
The human voice. It's the instrument we all play. It's the most powerful sound in the world, probably. It's the only one that can start a war or say, I love you. And yet many people have the experience that when they speak, people don't listen to them. Why is that? How can we speak powerfully to make change in the world?
The 2nd lesson focuses upon how to unlock the power of our voice. So I introduced this concept of voice control, vocal control, to my students, and I give them several examples of how they can manipulate their voice to achieve certain effects. For instance, using volume, pitch, inflection, or even changing the rate of their words, their speed. So this lesson has a lot of exercises in which students practice different sentences with different vocal effects. And I also provide an original notation system so that students can use these notes on their own anecdote script. So they're actively thinking about how they can manipulate their voice before they present their anecdotes. And in the 3rd class, the students share their anecdotes. They are not allowed to use a script. They deliver their anecdote while I'm recording them with the microphone. I compile the recordings into one show and I distribute the show to all students at the end. And also, they provide feedback to each other. Let's listen to an example from a student.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CE2, a story from my life featuring stories from Aichi Prefectural University students.
This is part 1, Storyteller 1.
I like to talk about the time when I was 7 years old. I was riding a swing in the park near my house. I was waiting for other kids, including seniors, to gather and go to school together. Basically, seniors occupied the swings, so I couldn't ride them. However, luckily, there was one empty swing on that day. I was so happy and rushed to it. I swung many times with full of joy. But suddenly, the world went black. Yes, I fell off from the swing.
So, as you heard from that snippet of my student's story, her most reportable event is falling off a swing when she was a child. She goes on to explain what happened, and she's fine now. She doesn't have any scars or anything of that nature. By the way, I cover these lessons in detail in an article I published in the Journal of NELTA, and I will share with you the link if you're interested in reading it. Let's move on to my research. As the title of my JALT presentation suggests, gathering students' perspectives on anecdotes in L2 identity formation, essentially I was at a starting point. I was wondering if the classroom task about which I was puzzling was worthy of further inquiry, for instance, through a doctoral program. So it all started in the spring of 2020. I was teaching at a public university in Japan within an English for Academic Purposes EAP program. My participants were 28 second year English majors, and that was divided into two classes. So we looked at the anecdote lessons and the anecdote task at the end of the three lessons. According to the research, there's quite a gap in terms of instructor or student perspectives, especially with respect to SLA and storytelling. And in terms of anecdotes, these types of reports are quite rare. For reference, take a look at Lukarevsky 2016. This study was qualitative in nature, and I chose narrative inquiry as the research methodology. I selected narrative frames as the main research instrument. Hiratsuka writes, narrative inquiry has become a vital tool for academic research on language teaching and learning. One of its research instruments is narrative frames. These are sets of written story templates consisting of sentence starters, followed by blank spaces and conjunctions that prompt participants to write down their ideas in a narrative form. So essentially, it's a survey in a story form. Please read my narrative frame instrument for this pilot study. So data was collected and coded, and I'm happy to share with you the results of two research questions that I had. Research question one was, what are students' perspectives on the anecdote task? So here are the results. The most common response is that the anecdote task was useful, helpful, or beneficial. Many participants cited language skills, presentation skills, or relevance to the future. The next most common response is that the task was interesting. Some cited that this was the first time to do such a task. Some also cited that they were very interested in listening to their classmates' stories. The third most common response, that it was good or great. Participants talked about receiving advice from the instructor and also feedback from classmates. Other responses included that the anecdote task was easy to understand, fresh, fun, important, necessary, not too bad, practical, and lastly, tough for me. So according to other responses, only two were negative or neutral in nature. Let's turn our attention to narrative and identity. I used Dan McAdams' life story model of identity. In this model, McAdams says that life identity is essentially a story. He goes on to write, life stories are based on biological facts, but they go considerably beyond the facts, as people selectively appropriate aspects of their experience and imaginatively construe both past and future to construct stories that make sense to them and to their audiences, that vivify and integrate life and make it more or less meaningful. Let's hear from Dan McAdams himself explain more about his model.
Is to consider this idea that we create ourselves, we make ourselves whole through stories by constructing internalized and evolving life narratives. These stories are heavily shaped by culture. Indeed, we borrow from our culture to make our stories. These stories help to explain ourselves to each other and to ourselves, and they provide our kind of messed up lives with a certain kind of semblance of meaning and purpose. So I don't know, I'm pretty skeptical about the idea of a soul, but I do think we all have stories.
Now let's take a look at the results of my second research question. How might anecdotes affect identity formation? So I took a look at the content of the participants' anecdotes, and I classified them into genres and identified themes, and this is how frequently they appeared. So the most common story genre was a mistake type of anecdote, these including several stories of falling down and sleeping. The second most common story genre was travel. This included study abroad experiences, international holidays, and so on. The third most common story genre, these were happiness stories, birthdays, live concerts, also travel. So some of the stories had multiple genres. The fourth most common story genre was a story of victory. Several of these mention sports competitions or musical performances. Other themes included fear, fun, mischief, sadness, and wisdom. Let's take a look at quotes from the actual anecdotes and consider how they might show identity formation in an L2. Let's take a look at the mistake genre. So in this anecdote, essentially what happened was the student fell asleep on a train. She wrote, "On that day, I posted this whole story on Instagram and I received many comments from my friends like, 'What are you doing?' And 'You are so stupid.' Yes, I know I was very stupid." So what's interesting here is that not only was she sharing the anecdote in a spoken form in a class project, but she was also sharing this story through a digital means on Instagram. Let's take a look at the travel story genre, and it reads, "I went to Oklahoma, the US, and I stayed with the host family for 2 weeks. At that time, I was a first year student in high school. I was so nervous because it was the first time for me to study abroad." So in this story, my student shared a precious memory of her study abroad experience. Here's a happiness story. "Adrenaline remained for a while after the concert ended. My friend said, 'I could just die.' We went home while discussing the impressions of the concert. When I look back on that concert now, that was definitely the most moving, exciting, and unforgettable event in my life." What's notable about this story is that earlier in his anecdote, he actually talks about how he was so happy that he was crying. And I thought that took some bravery on his part. And here's a quote from A Story of Victory. The student writes, "But surprisingly, at that time, I could run the course till the end and made good time. This thing made me realize that I can do anything. It gave me big confidence." So I think out of all of the quotes, this shows a strong assertion towards this student's identity formation, right? He's showing that he could overcome obstacles, that he was victorious in the face of this challenge. Let's move on to the discussion and implications. According to the data, I can say that a vast majority of the students rated the anecdote positively. There were only 2 non-positive comments. Also noteworthy is that sharing anecdotes in English class was a new experience to them. Several of my participants cited that. In particular, they found voice modulation or voice control quite useful. And several students reported that they found it relevant to their futures and lives outside of the classroom. In terms of identity formation, it's unclear to me whether anecdotes allowed for a strong assertion of their L2 identity, but I can say that the anecdote form itself provides a template for them to form such an identity in English. And here are some key quotes from some of my students, and their names have been changed to protect their privacy. Bruce writes, "I had never done this in English class." Mo reports, "I learned many things for telling story, and that was useful to study English to work in the future." And Jane writes, "I will try to tell the story for not only my friends, but also children." In closing, I'd like to share some words from Michelle Obama.
But I do know myself. My father, Fraser, taught me to work hard, laugh often, and keep my word. My mother, Marion, showed me how to think for myself and to use my voice. Together, in our cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago, they helped me see the value in our story, in my story, in the larger story of our country, even when it's not pretty or perfect, even when it's more real than you want it to be. Your story is what you have, what you will always have. It's something to own.
Indeed, our personal stories are something to own, and I hope you consider providing that opportunity to your students to own their stories. Well, those are my initial findings. As is the case with any story, I'm sure there are multiple perspectives or interpretations. I welcome any comments, questions, or suggestions that you might have. Thank you for listening and have a great day.